next is Chowder on Cartoon Network. Coming up next is Batman, the Brave and the Bold on Cartoon Network. Coming up next is Johnny Test on Cartoon Network. Coming up next is Tom and Jerry on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Bakugan Battle Brawlers on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Ben 10 on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Codename Kids Next Door on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Ben 10 Alien Force on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Camp Lazlo on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Ed, Edd and Eddy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's The Marvelous Misadventures of Flapjack on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's 16 on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Garfield on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy on Cartoon Network. Up next, The Powerpuff Girls continues on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's My Gym Partner's a Monkey on Cartoon Network. Coming up next is Robot Boy on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's a new episode of The Secret Saturdays on Cartoon Network. Coming up next. Up next, it's Total Drama Action on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Ben 10 Ultimate Alien on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Chaotic on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Generator Rex on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Hot Wheels Battle Force 5 on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Pokemon Diamond and Pearl Galactic Battles on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Star Wars The Clone Wars on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's an all-new Totally Spies on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Teen Titans on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's the Superhero Squad Show on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's George of the Jungle on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Courage the Cowardly Dog on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Scooby-Doo, Where Are You on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Steven Universe on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Pokemon on Cartoon Network. Coming up, it's Adventure Time on Cartoon Network. It's Regular Show on Cartoon Network. Up next, it's Angry Birds Tubans on Cartoon Network. Coming up next, it's Dexter's Laboratory on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Mr. Bean on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Hi Hi Puppy Ami Yumi on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's Sheep in the Big City on Cartoon Network.
Coming up next, it's The Bedfellows on Cartoon Network.